Hey y'all, welcome back to another week of our podcast, Pardon Please. In this podcast, we look at different cases over American history where the person found guilty in fact deserves a pardon. My name is Emma.
And my name is Patrick, and this week we're going back to 1989, and we're going to be looking at the case of Texas inmate number 980, Claude Jones.
So for new listeners, we always start our show with the 15-second updates of our life. So as y'all know, we took last week off of the podcast because we were on spring break, but we are so happy to be back this week. I went to Savannah for St. Patty's Day and got to enjoy all the wonderful restaurants and shops on River Street, and I got to spend time with a lot of my hometown friends. I even got to eat at that restaurant where Ginny and Forrest Gump worked. So it was a really good week. Patrick, what's your 15 seconds?
So I went to Orange Beach with my roommates. Yes, I know, I drove 6.5 hours to hang out with people I hang out with and see every day. But it was an awesome week. It was almost like it was out of a movie. And it's tough adjusting back to the real life after a week of being in paradise, but here we are. Also went home and saw my parents and my dog, which was nice since I live over an hour away from them. So back to what today's episode is all about.
Claude Howard Jones was executed by lethal injection on December 7, 2000, after being found guilty of murdering a local liquor store employee by the name of Alan Hilzendager. Today we are speaking directly to the Texas Board of Executioners in an attempt to clear his name and deliver a posthumous pardon to the deserving Claude Howard Jones.
In November of 1989, Claude Jones had recently been released from prison, and he was placed on parole. He also began hanging around two other men. These men were known as Kerry Daniel Dixon, also referred to as Danny Dixon, and Timothy Mark Jordan. Claude Jones's case orients itself all around a liquor store in the town of Point Blank, which is inside San Jacinto County, Texas. Point Blank is about an hour and 20 minutes outside of Houston. There were two witnesses, a father and his teenage daughter, that did describe a truck matching the description of Kerry Dixon's outside the liquor store. They also saw one man enter the store. However, the witnesses that saw the man could not positively identify the man later on.
The only two witnesses to the crime were the father and his teenage daughter. Alan Hilzendager was the only employee working at the liquor store, and upon the perpetrator's entry of the liquor store, Alan was shot dead. Once police arrived, they were able to work the crime scene, but there was not a lot of evidence found at the scene. There were no security cameras either. Keep in mind, this was 1989. What they did find at the scene of the crime was a few strands of hair that were near the cash register. Other than that, though, there was not much evidence in this case. Like previously stated, the only two witnesses to the crime could not identify the perpetrators. Yet they were able to identify that it was Kerry Dixon's truck that was outside of the liquor store at the time of the murder.
This led to Kerry Dixon and Timothy Jordan being arrested for murder in late November of 1989. It was not until December of 1989 that Claude Jones was arrested in connection to the murder. The trial was set to proceed in August of 1990, and here Jordan and Dixon were seen as co-conspirators in the case, yet not the ones responsible for Alan Hilzendager's murder. At trial, Timothy Mark Jordan testified that Claude had confessed to the murder on more than just one occasion. There was also a chemist who stated in the trial that the hair collected as evidence from the scene of the crime could have only belonged to Claude Jones and no one else implicated in the crime. Following the trial, Jones is convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Yet Jones continued to plead his innocence, and his case was heard by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in December of 1994. Yet here his conviction and death sentence were upheld, with the majority opinion citing the hair as critical physical evidence tying Jones to the crime. There was one final push for a stay of execution, but that was denied. But we will talk about that more coming up.
And so, for now, a word from our sponsors.
Haha, just kidding. Now back to the story.
Ultimately, Claude Jones was executed by lethal injection on December 7, 2000, and his final words were, "To your family, I hope that this can bring some closure to y'all. I am so sorry for your loss, and hey, I love all y'all, let's go." Yep, what we saw happen in Claude Jones' case was not just a one-time altercation. This has been happening for decades and to hundreds of innocent people. Claude Jones' case and conviction were fully based on forensic evidence that ultimately was not connected to him. Throughout his case, and even up until his execution, Claude maintained his claims of innocence. There was a 2, almost 3 centimeter long piece of hair that was found at the liquor store in Point Blank, Texas, and that was the key evidence used for sending Claude Jones to his ultimate and untimely death. Claude held to the statement that he in fact never even entered the liquor store on November 14, 1989. The hair found at the scene was in fact never tested for DNA before Claude Jones was executed. His family and attorneys even pushed for a stay of execution through George W. Bush, who was the governor of Texas at the time, the day before his death. They did this in an attempt to try and have the hair now tested for DNA, yet ultimately he was denied DNA testing of the hair and was then executed the next day. The push to test the hair for DNA evidence after Claude's death was not forgotten, though. After fighting lawsuits and intense court battles, the DNA test results were released in November of 2010. Upon the release of the results, it was found that the one piece of physical evidence that tied Claude Jones to the crime did not belong to him. It should be noted, though, that the hair belonged to the victim and did not provide a possible lead into alternate suspect theories.
Here are the actual results of that DNA test. Dr. Terry Melton was the forensic examiner responsible for conducting the mitochondrial DNA test on the strand of hair that was left at the scene. Ultimately, Dr. Melton concluded that the hair follicle matched the DNA profile of hair from the victim, Alan Hilzendager. In the results section of the report, Dr. Melton states that Alan Hilzendager and his maternal relatives cannot be excluded as the contributor of this questioned hair. Claude Jones and Danny Dixon are excluded as the contributors of this questioned hair. When jurors had to listen to the case of Claude, they heard multiple testimonies from experts that stated the strand of hair was in fact Claude's. This ultimately had to influence the way the jurors saw the case, and because of this, the jury did find him guilty and sent him to his death. Although the hair cannot fully rule out that Claude was not involved in other ways, it should bring attention to the sheer importance of proper DNA testing and the effects they can have within our justice system.
Earlier, we mentioned Carrie Dixon and Timothy Mark Jordan, who were Claude's acquaintances he had been hanging around in late 1989 with. At the trial, Timothy Mark Jordan spoke, and his testimony of apparently seeing Claude commit the murder helped to solidify the case against Claude Jones. However, since the trial and since Claude has been executed, he has since recanted his statements. On May 24, 2004, Timothy Mark Jordan gave an official affidavit, and this provides so much more information about this case. Timothy stated that everything he knew about Alan Hilzendager's murder all came from Carrie Daniel Dixon. He goes on and elaborates on the fact that Claude never once spoke to him about the murder, and that it was Dixon that told him of Claude's involvement in the incident. He finishes his affidavit by saying, "Jones not only never spoke to me about the Hilzendager murder, he also never threatened me in connection with it. It was Dixon who told me, Jones will have your family killed if you don't stand strong." He then alarmingly states, "I was threatened by law enforcement in connection with Hilzendager's murder case until I agreed to change what I was telling them. I was threatened with a murder charge and told I'd get the death penalty. I took a deal because I was scared, and I testified to what they told me to say."
It is important to note the state in which all of this occurred, Texas. Texas is known for using the death penalty more than any other state. In fact, Texas executions make up a third of all executions within the United States. It should be noted that within capital convictions like Claude Jones' conviction, there are often high rates of reversals. Yet if we are sending someone to death, we should be absolutely sure, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that the person convicted is the one responsible. Claude cannot tell his story today, so we must have to. We must use this as a fight to push for better and more rigorous DNA testing practices and to go back and reinvestigate old cases because we know this isn't the only story like this.
Claude Jones was an innocent man, and only he knew it. He knew that he was wrongfully being executed, but he wanted to die with dignity. He wanted to die a good death. His last words were, "I love all y'all. Let's go." This shows that Claude Jones wanted to die with dignity and respect. His family was working on getting his execution date moved, but could not get it moved. So he met his death openly, and he accepted his death. He did not cry, he did not scream, he did not beg for the executioners to wait a little longer. He knew that this was the end for him. The last thing he thought about was how he hoped his death would bring some closure to the people that were affected by someone else's actions.
Over 8,700 people have been executed in the United States. At least 150 have been exonerated since their execution. Yes, that sounds like a small number overall, but these are 150 parts of people's families. 150 sons and daughters, 150 lives that were lost because they were put to death for a crime they did not commit. There needs to be change with how some states use the death penalty, especially Texas. Over 30% of all uses of capital punishment come from Texas. We are speaking directly to the Texas Board of Executioners in an attempt to prevent future cases being like Claude Jones's case.
So I hope you all agree, based on the facts we presented within today's episode, that Claude Howard Jones, in fact, does deserve a full posthumous pardon. We were so happy to be recording again this week, and we cannot wait to talk to y'all next week. Make sure to follow us on all our social media so you can stay updated with all news. Pardon, please. Bye, y'all.
Goodbye.